Something happened in Makkah that almost no one talks about, yet it changed the direction of Islamic history forever. It was not a battle. It was not a miracle. It was a moment when the entire future of Tawheed hung on a single decision. And if that decision had gone differently, Islam as we know it today would have been unrecognizable. Before we continue, tell me from which country you are watching this. And if you love Islam, subscribe so you never miss reminders like this. Now listen closely, because this story reveals something every Muslim today absolutely needs to understand. For years in Makkah, the message of the Prophet Muhammad, the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, kept spreading no matter how hard the Quraysh tried to silence it. They insulted him, pressured him, sent delegations to his uncle, tortured his followers, and even plotted to kill him. Yet every effort only pushed more people to question their idols and think about the oneness of Allah. This terrified the Quraysh leaders because Islam was not just a spiritual threat in their eyes. It was a threat to their economy, their political power, and their entire identity. They were the custodians of hundreds of idols around the Kaaba, and people from every tribe visited Makkah to worship those idols, bringing wealth and status to Quraysh. But Islam was stripping that away by declaring that all of those idols were false and powerless. The chiefs saw their influence slipping through their fingers. Something had to be done. They had tried force, and they failed. So now they turned to something more subtle, something they were sure the Prophet would accept. A compromise that looked peaceful, diplomatic, and fair on the outside, but was a deadly trap on the inside. The plan began with a meeting among the leaders of Quraysh. Names like Al-Walid, Abu Jahl, and others gathered in private, frustrated and exhausted from failed attempts to stop the spread of the Qur'an. They argued among themselves, each proposing ideas that had already been tried and defeated. Then someone said something the rest had never seriously considered. What if we stop attacking him? What if we pretend to support him, as long as he supports us? The room quieted. It was a new direction. Instead of fighting the message of Islam, they would mix falsehood with it. Instead of tearing it down, they would water it down. They all knew that once a pure message becomes mixed with corruption, it is only a matter of time before the truth fades completely. And so Quraysh prepared what they believed was the perfect proposal. They would offer the Prophet a deal that seemed peaceful, cooperative, and respectful, but at its core, it demanded the impossible, the compromise of Tawheed. The first attempt came through Abu Talib. Quraysh went to the Prophet's uncle, hoping to pressure him into forcing his nephew to tone down his message. They said, "Tell him to stop insulting our gods. Tell him to stop dividing our people. We will make peace with him." But the Prophet refused to abandon the truth, even for a moment. He would never soften the message of monotheism to please the people. So Quraysh switched strategies. They approached the Prophet directly, face to face, with their most dangerous offer yet. They said, "Worship our gods for 1 year, and we will worship your God for 1 year." They presented it like a gesture of unity, a symbol of tolerance, an agreement of coexistence. They promised that by doing this, there would be no more conflict, no more insults, no more pressure. They even hinted at offering him leadership positions, status, and influence over all of Makkah. To them, this was the greatest possible compromise. To us today, it sounds absurd, but to the Quraysh, this was the smartest attack they had ever designed. They believed the Prophet would accept it because they misunderstood him completely. They assumed he was motivated by power, recognition, or social harmony. They thought he wanted acceptance from the people. They thought he wanted to soften the conflicts in society. But the messenger of Allah did not speak for himself. He spoke only what was revealed to him. And Tawheed cannot be negotiated, adjusted, softened, or blended with shirk. So he did not respond immediately. He simply listened carefully, not because he was considering their offer, but because the response needed to come from Allah Himself. This proposal was not a small temptation. It was not merely an invitation to worship idols with them. It was a strategic move to destroy Islam from within by mixing truth and falsehood until no one could tell which was which. This tactic has been used throughout history. When people fail to destroy a religion through aggression, they try to corrupt it through compromise. Quraysh wanted Islam to stay alive but lose its purity. They wanted to create a version of Islam that allowed idols. A version that pleased everyone, but pleased Allah the least. They wanted a middle path that did not exist. This was the real trap, not to destroy Islam, but to dilute it. The Prophet Muhammad, the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, stood calmly as Quraysh finished presenting their offer, not because he was considering it, but because every word they spoke revealed how desperate they had become. They had tried threats, they had tried bribes, they had tried social pressure, but now they were attempting something far more dangerous, spiritual negotiation. They wanted him to bend, even slightly, thinking that a small compromise would be harmless. Quraysh believed that if he agreed to worship their idols, even once, even symbolically, then the purity of Islam would be broken forever. And they knew that once purity is broken, it is almost impossible to restore. What they did not understand is that the heart of a prophet does not waver. It does not shift with the convenience of the world. It remains anchored to revelation, guided only by the truth that comes from Allah. So as Quraysh waited for an answer, thinking they had finally cornered him, a silence filled the air. A silence so heavy that even the most arrogant of them felt the weight of it. They had no idea that at that exact moment an answer was already descending from above the seven heavens. Angel Jibreel, peace be upon him, descended with a revelation that cut through every proposal, every negotiation, every illusion of compromise. A revelation that would act as a shield for Islam from that day until the final day. This was not simply a message to Quraysh. It was a message to every nation, every generation, every heart that tries to mix truth with falsehood. The Prophet did not speak until Allah commanded him to. And when the command came, it was unlike anything Quraysh had heard before. It was direct. It was decisive. It was final. Say, Allah commanded, making it clear that these were not the words of Muhammad, but the words of the Lord of all creation. The revelation came down like a sword that severs two paths that can never come together. O disbelievers! A statement that carried no insult, but a clear boundary. A boundary that clarified identity, clarified belief, clarified purpose. Quraysh had presented their offer, thinking that unity required blending religions together. But unity built on falsehood is not unity at all. It is spiritual collapse. So Allah continued, I do not worship what you worship, is less than #0. 5# is greater than. In that single line, centuries of idol worship were rejected, not with violence, not with political maneuvering, but with pure, unwavering Tawheed. The surah continued repeating the same meaning from different angles, as if to seal every door that leads to misinterpretation. And you do not worship what I worship. And I will never worship what you have worshipped. Nor will you ever worship what I worship. These lines were not accidental repetition. They were layers of spiritual protection. A divine declaration that there is no middle path between Tawheed and shirk. Each repetition was a strike against Quraysh's attempt to mix Islam with idolatry. It was Allah Himself refusing their offer in the most explicit way possible. He did not leave a single gap, not a single possible interpretation that someone could later manipulate. The message was clear. You have your way, and I have mine. Your religion is yours, built on false gods and human invention, and mine is mine, built on pure devotion to Allah alone. Quraysh had tried to negotiate the foundations of faith, but Allah responded by drawing a permanent line that no believer could ever cross. And when the Prophet recited these verses to Quraysh, they were stunned. Not because the surah insulted them, but because it shattered their illusion of control. They approached, thinking they were offering a reasonable agreement. They walked away, realizing Allah had instead delivered a declaration that echoed through the streets of Makkah like thunder. This surah was not just a response to Quraysh in that moment. It became a timeless weapon against every force that tries to reshape Islam, redefine its principles, or merge it with beliefs that contradict its core. Scholars explained that this surah serves as a complete disassociation from shirk. Not a disassociation from people, not a call to hatred, but a disassociation from false worship. It protects the believer's heart so that even under pressure, even under fear, even under temptation, the worship of Allah remains uncorrupted. And this is why the Prophet would recite this surah regularly. He would recite it before sleeping, sealing his night with a declaration of pure monotheism. He would recite it in the Sunnah prayers of Fajr and Maghrib, as if reminding the Ummah at the beginning and end of each day that Tawheed cannot be negotiated. It is said in authentic narrations that this surah is equal to 1/4 of the Qur'an. Why? Because the Qur'an is built on 4 grand themes: Tawheed, law, stories, and matters of the unseen. And this surah captures the essence of Tawheed more directly than almost any other chapter. It is not a surah of details. It is a surah of identity. It tells every Muslim, you are not defined by culture, tribe, pressure, or the expectations of this world. You are defined by your worship of Allah alone. This is not just a story of the past. This surah speaks to today's world with shocking relevance. Is less than #0. 5# is greater than. Because even now, there are constant attempts to make Muslims adjust their faith to fit into modern expectations. Change this rule. Soften that belief. Do not be too strict about worship. Blend your faith with our values. The pressure may not come with threats the way it did in Makkah, but it often comes with social pressure, political messaging, or cultural trends that treat firm faith as something outdated. Yet this surah stands like a mountain, reminding the believer that truth does not bend. Truth does not adapt to make people more comfortable. Truth remains truth regardless of who accepts it or rejects it. Surah Al-Kafirun teaches the Ummah how to draw boundaries without aggression, how to stand firm without hostility, and how to remain dignified without compromise. It tells us that we do not need to imitate the world to gain respect. Respect comes from staying true to what Allah has revealed. And when a Muslim recites this surah today, they are reminding themselves of the same message that once echoed through Makkah. Your way is yours. My way is mine. Not as a rejection of people, but as a rejection of falsehood. Not as a call to separation, but as a protection of faith. And in a world filled with confusion, opinions, and shifting moral values, this surah gives the believer clarity, courage, and conviction. The moment Surah Al-Kafirun was revealed, it became more than a response to Quraysh. It became a declaration of identity for every believer who would come after. It taught the Ummah that firmness in faith does not require harshness, and clarity does not require cruelty. It simply requires a heart anchored in the worship of Allah alone. This surah gave Muslims a spiritual backbone at a time when they were being pressured from every direction. It reminded them that they belonged to something pure, something unshakable, something that could not be negotiated even if the entire world stood against them. It taught them that true courage is not found in raising a sword or shouting slogans, but in refusing to compromise the core truth that defines who they are. In the years that followed, whenever a believer recited this surah in prayer or before going to sleep, they were repeating the same words that once silenced the entire council of Quraysh. They were echoing a message that protected their ancestors from falling into the traps of idolatry. They were reminding themselves that worship is not a cultural habit, not a social trend, not a political statement, but a sacred devotion owed only to the one who created them. This is why the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, recited this surah so frequently. It was not simply a chapter of 6 verses. It was a shield for the heart. A reminder that even if the world changes, the believer's worship does not. And this is what makes this surah incredibly powerful for today's generation. Because today, the pressure does not always come from tyrants or tribal chiefs. Sometimes it comes from subtle influences. From society telling you, you can be Muslim, but do not be too Muslim. From workplaces saying, you can pray, but do not make it noticeable. From social circles saying, believe what you want, just make sure it does not challenge the values of today. The forces trying to reshape Islam today are not trying to destroy it openly. They are trying to make it softer, more diluted, and less recognizable. The same tactic Quraysh used when they said, worship our gods for a year, and we will worship your God for a year. They wanted a version of Islam that fit their expectations, not the one Allah revealed. Surah Al-Kafirun speaks directly to this modern pressure. It tells you that your relationship with Allah does not depend on public approval, cultural acceptance, or social trends. It depends on the purity of your heart and your commitment to the truth. It teaches you that you can live peacefully with people of all backgrounds, but you cannot adopt beliefs that contradict your faith to make others comfortable. It teaches you that respect does not come from blending your identity, but from upholding it with sincerity and grace. And most importantly, it teaches you that the worship of Allah cannot be shared, borrowed, merged, or negotiated. This surah is a declaration of spiritual independence. It frees the believer from the need to imitate anyone. It frees the believer from the fear of standing alone. It frees the believer from the anxiety of trying to fit into every environment at the cost of their faith. It reminds them that their greatest honor is not in being liked by people, but in being accepted by Allah. When a Muslim lives with this understanding, their heart becomes strong, steady, and tranquil. They stop seeking validation from society and start seeking it from the one who fashioned their soul. And this brings us to the deeper wisdom of why this surah ends with the words, "For you is your way, and for me is mine." This is not a dismissal of humanity. It is not a call for separation or hatred. It is a declaration of boundaries. It tells the believer that respecting others does not require agreeing with their beliefs. It tells the world that Muslims can coexist peacefully without abandoning the truth. It sets a framework of mutual respect that does not compromise spiritual integrity. You do not need to shame others for their beliefs, nor do you need to dilute your own. You walk your path with clarity, and they walk theirs, and the judgment belongs to Allah alone. But the surah was not only sent to address the religion of Quraysh, it was sent to protect the Ummah until the final day. It was sent because Allah knew there would come a time when truth and falsehood would mix so deeply that many people would not even recognize the difference. A time when false ideas would be sugar-coated with soft language. A time when moral lines would blur. A time when believers would be told that compromise is the only way to avoid conflict, is less than #0. 5# is greater than this surah was revealed, so that the Ummah never loses its clarity in these moments. Every believer today feels the world pulling at their faith in one direction or another. Some are pressured to modernize their beliefs. Some are pressured to hide their worship. Some are pressured to silence their Islamic identity to avoid criticism. But this surah reminds them that the strength of a Muslim is not in bending to pressure, but in standing firm with dignity. Not arrogance, not hostility, but dignity. The dignity that comes from knowing exactly who you worship and why. The dignity that comes from knowing your purpose. The dignity that comes from knowing your Creator has given you something priceless, the truth. This is the lesson that echoes through chapter 9 of this story. When Surah Al-Kafirun descended, it cut through the plans of Quraysh with a clarity they could not escape. It destroyed their illusions of negotiation, because truth is not something you bargain with. It is something you stand upon. And today, when you recite this surah, you are not simply repeating ancient words. You are declaring your independence from anything that tries to corrupt your worship. You are reminding your own heart that nothing deserves your devotion except Allah. You are aligning yourself with the same courage that the early Muslims held when they faced the entire city of Mecca with unshakable faith. This surah calls you to clarity. It calls you to purity. It calls you to honesty in worship. It calls you to live your Islam with beautiful firmness. And it calls you to walk through this world without fear of losing yourself, because Allah has already given you a path that cannot be broken as long as you stay true to it. Surah Al-Kafirun was revealed because Quraysh tried to reshape Islam. Today, many forces are trying to do the same, in different forms, with different words. But the surah remains the same. The message remains the same. And the believers who understand it remain protected by the same clarity that guarded the earliest Muslims.